So let's start from the remote work itself. So you have worked in remote setup or hybrid sometimes for more than 2 decades. Most of the people has just started working remotely during the pandemic. And some people are even going back to the office these days. So working remote is something that is unique experience, but I'm sure it's not unique to you. What are some of the key things, if you can share, when the pandemic happened? Like, is there anything that you need to do differently from the previous remote setup that you did?
Well, I think one of the things that is true about remote work is that it works incredibly well for some people and not at all for other people. And there are a number of people in between, of course, too. I think we've all learned in a lot of ways in the last couple of years is that there's no point in being pedantic about what's better or worse. It really depends on different individuals and the culture of different companies. Even though I personally prefer remote work and have found it to be over time more productive, and I can talk about that, I want to be careful to note that there are lots of people for whom, for any number of reasons, it's not the best mode. And it's worth investigating for your company what's best and being upfront with people when you're hiring so that there's not like luring people on a false premise. But that said, I think there's a number of things about remote work that I have found to be more effective. And some of it is just that to do remote work well requires good management. And that's true in person too. Like you can get more juice out of good management than you can out of bad management. But in a remote setting, you have to be, for example, more intentional about communication. It doesn't happen coincidentally. Now, I think that's a benefit. Having leaders and managers who have to be more intentional tend to be better leaders and people get better information more consistently. You can do that in person, but lots of people kind of forget or it doesn't seem as necessary. So there's lots of things like that where remote work just kind of reinforces good practices. But I think there's also some more subtle things about it that are kind of interesting. So, for example, a few years ago, before the pandemic, I noticed myself saying to somebody that I preferred working in remote companies because they tend to be higher trust environments, and higher trust, lots of research shows, makes for much more productive and happier teams. And it was a little funny when I heard myself say that because the conventional wisdom is that remote work is low trust. I did some research into why I might have felt that way and why that might not be the conventional wisdom. And I think what's interesting is that it turns out that people have different ways that they build trust with other people and different ways that they feel trusted. So there's some psychological terms for this, and I hope I'm not getting these wrong, but there's this idea that some people have a high propensity for trust and some people have a low propensity. And I want to be clear, I don't think that's the low propensity is a judgment, it's just a different mode. And the people who are low propensity feel more trusted when people see them, and they trust other people when they can see them. That's part of their experience of trust. And they tend to start off, the low propensity means they start off not trusting people very much, and you can kind of build that up. And part of the way you build it up is by seeing each other. People who have a high propensity start off more trusting, and you can kind of lower the amount of trust, certainly. But they also tend to be people who don't need to be seen to be trusted and who don't need to see other people. They are more interested in the work product. So you can see where people like that tend to be drawn to remote work and tend to feel like very trusted and like they can trust their colleagues in a setting that is kind of designed for the work product being the thing that's most important. So I think there's a number of subtleties like that about remote work that we're still learning and will take a while to get figured out.
So it's interesting that you mentioned about this propensity of trust, right? I can get it. For example, if you are a totally remote company and you have to hire people, definitely you need to have a lot of trust with the people. Also for the employee themselves, right? They need to put a lot of trust in the employer, even though they may not see the bosses, they may not see the officers, the colleagues and things like that. Maybe in the first place, how can we gauge this propensity of trust for a candidate or maybe for an employer, right? How can we actually gauge that this is a good, trusted place that we can go to? Is there some tips that you normally do whenever you gauge candidates or when you look at the next company that you want to join? Maybe some tips here for people who love working remotely.
Yeah, well, I think one advantage that we have gained is that in the last couple of years, a lot of people have figured out whether they like remote work and whether they hate it. And a lot of times, if they like it, they are like the high trusting high propensity, and a lot of times when they don't, they're low propensity. So there's a little bit of auto filtering. I learned recently that in the time since before the pandemic, LinkedIn has seen only a small bump in the number of companies that list remote jobs. You would think it'd be like a huge increase, and it's something like it went from 3% to 13% of their job listings. But the job seekers went from like 3% to 50%. A lot of people are looking for remote work. And I think that's a lot of people have discovered that they are more productive in a remote setting and happier. And they might not associate that with trust. So it's a hard thing to ask about. And typically, you kind of want to try to gauge rather than ask directly for a lot of the things you want to learn in an interview anyway. One of the things that we do at Daily, where I am now, we sell real time audio and video APIs so that anybody can embed real time audio and video in any app or website. And so we're like a pretty technical company. And when we are hiring people, we do, for any kind of a role, we do a paid take home where the candidates produce on their own time some kind of work product that we've given them instructions for. And they can ask questions as they go, and then we talk it over. And that's the main thing that we use to make decisions about people. But it's not just what they produce. A lot of what we care about is how they talk to us about it. Do they ask important questions as they go when we're discussing things and we're talking about the decisions they made? Does that get into an interesting conversation where they're asking us questions and are being a little bit vulnerable? And when we ask them questions, they're able to say, I don't know, or be very clear about why they made decisions. And those kinds of signals are a lot of the sorts of signals that you get when you're trying to figure out trust with new colleagues. Are you able to ask questions? Are you able to answer questions? Are people defensive or not so defensive? So I think that kind of stuff, again, it's a little bit implicit, but can give you the sorts of signals that help you figure out if somebody's well suited for your culture.
That's a very interesting statistics that you mentioned there from LinkedIn, right? So I even experienced it myself whenever I interviewed candidates, right? Some of them would just say, yeah, I want to find jobs which are only remote. And there are plenty of them, which explained why LinkedIn statistics found that many candidates wanted to work remotely. But why do you think some companies wanted to go back to the previous setup? Even though during the pandemic, I'm sure most of them would have seen that it works as well working remotely. Is there anything in particular that you found with this trend?
So, one thing is, I do think there's lots of people, including lots of managers and leaders, who don't trust other people and don't feel trusted unless they see them. And they want to feel trusted as much as they want to trust other people. Like, that's very important. So, that's real for some people. I think, though, it is also the case, to be completely candid, that lots and lots of companies have spent a whole lot of money on real estate, and real estate leases last for years and years, sometimes decades, and they want to get some value out of the real estate. You could have a debate about whether that's a good motivation or not, but you could see if you've spent that money and you feel a greater sense of trust with your colleagues in an in-person setting or in a hybrid, like partially you're at least in person some of the time, that can start to feel pretty compelling in some cultures. There are also, of course, times when in person is more meaningful. A lot of people find that generative work, brainstorming, for example, is easier in person and richer. So that's valid. And there are times when it's probably not as useful to be in person. But on balance, it might be hard to figure out what's worth it and what's not. And if you have a culture where people are already used to it and the leaders tend to feel like they can trust people more and they've spent the money, you could kind of see that math adding up for some companies.
I think it makes sense, right? Some people wants to have more collaborative, want to have in-person meeting and maybe spark the creative conversation out of the blue, right? Not always in meetings, video meetings some more, which sometimes is a little bit fatigue, right? Another thing that you mentioned in your blogs that you have some other insights from doing remote work, which you have never heard before. Could you share maybe some other insights that you think are worth to share here apart from this higher trust? Because you said earlier that remote work sometimes breeds higher trust. Are there any other insights that you want to share with us here?
I think there are a couple of other things that are interesting. I mean, there's a few kind of basic ones I can talk about. For example, this is a little bit unconventional as well, but I have found that hard conversations tend to be easier over video than in person. So a lot of times people, if you have to deliver difficult feedback or if you're laying somebody off or having any kind of a really hard conversation like that, in person, people can feel really exposed, understandably. And of course, sometimes people cry and they have like a whole big range of emotions. When they're on video and you're a little removed from each other, sometimes that gives people a little bit of space to feel a little bit less uncomfortable with a hard conversation. And that's true on both sides of it, the manager and whomever is receiving the info. So I think that actually, surprisingly, can be a little bit better, a little counterintuitive. I think sometimes too, there's a real intimacy that you can get at work. This isn't true universally, but a lot of people working from home, you have a chance to see their space. You and I are on video right now, so you can see some of my books, and you might be able to hear that my dog is eating her dinner pretty loudly, which I apologize for. But you get a sense of my life a little bit. And it's a kind of a form of intimacy to be in each other's spaces, to see each other's families and pets. There's a lot more cats wandering around video screens and remote work, and a chance to be connected to each other beyond the selves that we bring to work. Now, for me, I find that to be like a very compelling kind of intimacy. When I'm in an office working with people now, I often feel like, how can I know you? Because I don't see the space that you inhabit otherwise, and I don't see your family and your pets. It feels pretty disconnected. It's totally fair that not everybody wants their family and pets in their house on screen all the time, but it's become relatively common. And to me, that often feels like a very big point of connection that we kind of lose in an office. You get different things in person, but a loss of a real context for a person's life. So those are a few of the basic things. I do think there are some other more subtle things, like a sense sometimes of having an in-group feeling where people for whom remote work works feels like you're part of a community, part of a group that is a little bit different from the world where it doesn't work. And that can be a little bit of a form of trust as well. So I think there's both some logistics to it and some kind of subtle human connection pieces that can be really powerful.